He left with nothing but faith, a worn leather satchel, and a walking staff carved with sacred symbols. Bishop Elias Carmichael was a man known for his unwavering devotion, his compassion, and a quiet strength that inspired an entire diocese. In the spring of 1993, he embarked on a pilgrimage through the northern mountain trails, an ancient path walked by countless men of faith before him. But unlike them, Bishop Elias never returned. No farewell, no note, no trace, as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. For months, search parties combed every inch of the rugged terrain. Locals, parishioners, even rescue dogs traced the narrow trails and dense woods where he was last seen. But nothing surfaced, not a footprint, not a torn scrap of cloth. Only silence. His disappearance became more than a tragedy. It became a mystery carved into the soul of the town, a question that lingered in every prayer, every Sunday Mass, every candle lit beneath his portrait. Some believed he'd lost his way. Others whispered about something darker, something that didn't want him to be found. Decades passed, 30 long years where his name became both legend and shadow. His absence weighed heavier than any tombstone, because no one could grieve what hadn't been confirmed. Families told their children stories of the bishop who vanished. Pilgrims avoided the trail where he was last seen, calling it cursed. And yet, the land kept it secret. Until one day it didn't. A group of hikers, exploring an abandoned trail long overtaken by wilderness, stumbled upon something no one was prepared for. Wedged between two crumbling stones, half buried beneath roots and time, was a walking staff. Weathered, cracked, but unmistakable. Carved into its shaft were the same sacred symbols, initials, and worn prayers that had accompanied Bishop Elias on his final journey. A staff that could not, have been there unless he had. That discovery didn't just reopen an old mystery. It shattered the illusion that the past was settled. Why was his staff there, miles from the path he was meant to follow? Why hadn't it been found all those years ago? And more terrifying, if the staff was there, what else had the forest been hiding? This is the story of the bishop who vanished on pilgrimage, and how, 30 years later, the mountains finally whispered back. Bishop Elias Carmichael wasn't just a man of faith. He was the cornerstone of a fractured community, a shepherd for lost souls, a living bridge between doubt and belief. His decision to undertake the pilgrimage wasn't impulsive. It was sacred. The path he chose was older than the church itself, a trail once walked by mystics, monks, and prophets seeking divine clarity. But on that spring morning in 1993, when he kissed the cathedral doors and set out alone with his staff in hand, no one imagined it would be the last time they saw him. For the first few days, everything seemed ordinary. Locals spotted him along the lower trails, offering blessings to farmers and weary travelers. Witnesses described him as peaceful but contemplative, as though carrying something heavier than his simple pack and staff. On the third day, a shopkeeper in the mountain village of Briars Hollow became the last person to speak to him. He asked for water, the man recalled, and then stared toward the hills like he was waiting or deciding. After that, silence. When he didn't return by the expected date, concern turned quickly into panic. Search parties mobilized. Helicopters swept over treetops. Dogs were brought in. But the trail grew colder with every passing hour. There were no footprints beyond a certain bend, no broken branches to indicate where he might have strayed. It was as if the path itself had simply ended him. Families lit candles. Parishioners gathered in circles, reciting psalms with trembling hands. But deep inside, a terrible question lingered. How does a man of God vanish without a trace? Rumors, as they often do, filled the void. Some believed he had succumbed to nature, a fall, a storm, an accident no one witnessed. Others whispered darker theories, that perhaps he had discovered something not meant to be found, something hidden in those hills. And then there were those who clung to the hope that he'd chosen to disappear, that he'd abandoned worldly life for a deeper spiritual calling, living somewhere beyond reach, beyond understanding. But the truth was more cruel, more haunting, because it was wrapped in uncertainty. Year after year, the case remained unsolved. His photos stayed pinned to the church bulletin board, colors fading under sunlight. New bishops came and went, But none could escape the shadow Elias left behind. His story became a cautionary tale, a wound the town learned to live with, but never heal. And then, 3 decades later, that wound was torn open. The hikers who found the staff had no connection to the church, no knowledge of the bishop's disappearance. They were simply exploring, young, curious, looking for adventure in a place most locals avoided. When one of them tripped over a knot of twisted roots, they noticed the strange shape wedged between the stones. At first, it seemed like debris, a fallen branch. But then they saw the carvings. Rough crosses lined the wood. Along the handle, a phrase written in Latin had worn down, but was still legible. Non temibo mala, I will fear no evil. And beneath it, the initials EC, weathered but undeniable. The hikers took photos, posted them online, unaware of what they had just set in motion. Within hours, the images spread, first locally, then nationally, then, somehow globally. Missing Bishop's staff found after 30 years. The headline ignited something dormant in everyone who remembered. Locals flocked to the site. The diocese sent representatives. Journalists descended on the quiet town, microphones in hand, chasing a story most had written off as unsolvable. The bishop's walking staff stood like a ghost tethered to the earth, a marker of unfinished stories, of questions still hanging in the wind. The trail itself was overgrown, unwalked for years. But the staff's location didn't make sense. It wasn't near any known path. It wasn't where search teams had focused back then. It was somewhere deliberately hidden. For the Carmichael family, what little remained of them, the discovery reawakened a pain they had learned to fold neatly into prayer. Elias had a younger sister, Margaret, now elderly, who hadn't spoken publicly in years. When interviewed, she said only this: if his staff was left there, then someone placed it there. My brother never let go of that staff unless something or someone made him. Her words sent a chill through everyone who heard them. And with that chilling thought, the questions multiplied. If the staff had been there for 3 decades, why hadn't it been found sooner? Was it truly overlooked, or was it never meant to be found until now? And if it was placed, who placed it? What were they trying to hide? Or worse, what were they trying to reveal? The discovery ignited something more than curiosity. It ignited fear. Not the kind of fear that makes you run, but the kind that makes you freeze. The kind that whispers, there's more to this. As experts and volunteers returned to the trail, they noticed details that had been invisible decades earlier. A section of earth near the staff's resting place was unnaturally disturbed. Moss-covered stones shifted, roots severed in ways that didn't align with natural growth. Someone had been here, not years ago, but recently. Among the investigators was Samuel, a forensic anthropologist who had worked cold cases for nearly 20 years. As he examined the area, he grew quiet, methodical. What concerned him wasn't just where the staff was, but what was missing around it. There's no sign of weathering beneath it, he noted. It's like it was placed there after the erosion, not before. His conclusion struck everyone silent. The staff hadn't been lying there for 30 years. Someone had moved it. Recently. But who? And why now? That question began to spread like wildfire through the community. Some speculated it was a cruel prank. Others whispered of confession, someone who could no longer carry the weight of silence. And a very few, wondered if it was a warning. A message left not for the bishop, but for those who kept looking. The forest, once a place of peace and pilgrimage, now felt suffocating, oppressive, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. As Samuel and his team dug deeper, both figuratively and literally, they uncovered something else. A fragment of cloth, weathered but intact, tangled in the roots near where the staff was found. When examined, it was identified as ecclesiastical fabric, the kind worn only by bishops on ceremonial pilgrimage. Faded, brittle, but unmistakably real. Another piece of Elias Carmichael's final day had surfaced, and with it, an even darker possibility. Because the fabric hadn't rotted fully, which meant it hadn't been exposed to the elements for 3 decades. Just like the staff. Whatever had happened back then, someone had kept parts of it hidden, preserved, controlled. The conclusion was undeniable now. Bishop Elias hadn't simply gotten lost. He hadn't simply vanished. Something, or someone, had made sure his story stayed buried for as long as possible. As the investigation deepened, an unsettling pattern emerged, something the original search teams had never considered. Old maps of the area showed paths that no longer existed. Trails deliberately removed from public records in the mid-1980s, just a few years before Elias's disappearance. One path, in particular, led to a series of caves tucked beneath the northern cliffs, a place locals called the Mouth of God, a site once used by pilgrims centuries ago, but later condemned for reasons no one seemed willing to document. Locals avoided the topic. When pressed, older residents would shake their heads and mutter, some places were never meant to be walked again. But Samuel and Leah, a local historian who had grown up hearing whispers about the bishop, weren't willing to accept silence as an answer. They unearthed archived town records long since forgotten. And in those pages, they found something chilling, a note written by Elias himself, just 3 days before he vanished. The note was brief, scribbled hastily in the margin of an old sermon draft. There's something wrong on this path. I feel it watching me, deciding. It wasn't the writing of a man lost in faith. It was the writing of a man sensing danger, imminent, deliberate, alive. The idea that a bishop, a man whose very life was dedicated to trust, to compassion, had felt something so deeply unsettling that he had to write it down, it shifted everything. Then came the most disturbing discovery yet. As Samuel and Leah traced the lost path toward the mouth of God, they found markers, symbols etched in a stone, partially obscured by moss and time. They weren't Christian symbols. They were older, cruder. Some are broken crosses, some inverted. Others were unfamiliar altogether. But they all seemed to point to one conclusion. Elias had seen something. Something he wasn't supposed to find. Something not meant to be discovered. And as Leah stood beneath the towering cliffs, staring into the gaping entrance of the cave system, she whispered what everyone else was thinking but hadn't dared to say aloud. He didn't just disappear. He was erased. As they prepared to enter the cave, an eerie stillness fell over the group. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the ground itself resisted their presence. Every step forward felt like trespassing on something ancient and deeply unwilling to be disturbed. Leah noticed how the light seemed to falter at the entrance, as if the shadows swallowed more than they should. It wasn't superstition. It was instinct. That primal sense that some places are meant to remain forgotten. Inside, the walls bore the same strange markings they'd seen along the trail. Etched deeper here, sharper, almost frantic. The symbols overlapped, some appearing centuries old, others disturbingly fresh. Deeper in, they found what no one had expected, remnants of a campsite. A rusted lantern, ashes in a fire pit, and scraps of fabric, modern, recent. Someone had been here. Not in 1993. Recently. Someone still came here. Samuel crouched near the fire pit, brushing away layers of dirt. His fingers hit something solid. A box. Small. Wooden. Bound in what appeared to be iron nails driven by hand. When he pried it open, everyone went silent. Inside were 3 items. A rosary, cracked and splintered. A page torn from a Bible, edges singed. And a photograph. Faded but clear. It was Bishop Elias, standing on the trail, smiling, but with something behind him. A shadow, blurry, indistinct, looming at the edge of the frame. The existence of the photo changed everything. How had it survived? Who had taken it? And why was it hidden here, inside this cave, protected like some sacred, or cursed, artifact? Leah's hands trembled as she held it. The timestamp on the back read April 3rd, 1993, the very day he vanished. This was proof. Irrefutable. He had made it further into the trail than anyone had known. And someone had been with him. Then came the final blow. Scrawled on the back of the photo, in handwriting both familiar and horrifying, were 5 words. He saw. He wouldn't leave. It was no longer a question of whether Elias had gotten lost. He hadn't. He had found something. Something so disturbing that someone, or something, had made sure he would never speak of it again. The revelation spread like wildfire. The photograph leaked online within hours, and with it, the world's eyes turned back toward the quiet mountain town that had tried for decades to forget. News crews arrived. Drone footage of the cave flooded social media. The church, once reluctant to reopen the investigation, now had no choice. But with the renewed attention came deeper fear. Fear that what had been hidden for 30 years was never meant for daylight. The diocese issued a statement, carefully worded, full of condolences, reflections on faith, but void of answers. Privately, however, they dispatched a team, quiet, discreet, to examine the site. But before they could arrive, Samuel, Leah, and a small group returned to the cave one final time, desperate to find the truth before it could be buried again. What they found wasn't just chilling, it was shattering. Deeper into the tunnels, they discovered a sealed chamber. It wasn't natural. The bricks were hand-laid, covered in moss and soot. Someone had deliberately closed it off. It took hours to break through, and when they did, the smell hit them first. Damp earth, old rot, and something else. Something metallic. Something human. Inside the chamber were bones. Not scattered. Arranged. Carefully. Respectfully. A makeshift shrine, or perhaps a warning. In the center of the chamber stood a cross, carved crudely from the same wood as the bishop's staff. It was broken, split down the middle, and tied to it, barely intact, was a strip of cloth matching the bishop's ceremonial robe. No name, no gravestone, no official burial, but every sign pointed to the same unspoken truth. This was where Bishop Elias Carmichael's pilgrimage had ended. Leah collapsed to her knees. The realization hit like a wave, sorrow, rage, and dread all tangled together. He hadn't simply vanished. He had been taken, and someone had ensured that for 3 decades, his story would remain a void in the earth, a whisper behind locked doors, a shadow on a trail no one dared walk. Until now, the discovery of the bones shattered every theory that had tried to soften the truth. It was no accident, no tragic misstep on an isolated trail. This was intentional, deliberate. The way the bones were placed, the care with which the chamber was sealed, it all spoke of a ritual, or worse, a warning meant to outlast memory itself. And yet, what chilled Leah and Samuel the most wasn't just what they found. It was the realization that someone had come back here, recently. Someone had ensured this secret remained buried. Forensics confirmed what their instincts already knew. The skeletal remains matched Bishop Elias's approximate height and build. The fragments of his robe were authenticated by the church archivist, an embroidered thread pattern used exclusively in that year's pilgrimage vestments. But even more disturbing was the state of the cross found within the chamber. The wood matched the walking staff, and tests revealed that the split through its center wasn't from decay. It was from force, from violence. As this information spread through the community, reactions fractured. Some responded with grief, mourning the man they'd lost for so long without knowing how. Others reacted with anger. How had this gone undiscovered for 3 decades? How had the church, the search teams, the authorities, all failed so completely? But a quieter, more unsettling question began to grow. What had Bishop Elias seen that was dangerous enough to silence him forever? Old journal entries recovered from the diocesan archives hinted at an answer. In the weeks leading up to his pilgrimage, Elias had written cryptic reflections. There are things even the faithful refuse to name. Not everything holy is pure. Not everything hidden is meant to be found. Lines like these now read less like musings and more like warnings. He had known, or at least, he had sensed that the trail he was walking carried more than just spiritual weight. Then came the most terrifying revelation of all. As forensic teams completed their sweep of the chamber, they uncovered fresh footprints, human, recent, left in the damp soil near the outer tunnel. Whoever had sealed this place decades ago had come back. Someone else still walked this trail. Someone who had unfinished business. Someone who now knew. Others had found what was never meant to be uncovered. The town shifted from shock to something darker, dread. The discovery had pulled back the veil, but what lay behind it wasn't closure. It was a deeper mystery, one that seemed to stretch its roots far beyond a missing bishop. People started recalling things they had pushed away for years. Stories of figures seen near the trail at dusk. Voices heard in the woods. Cattle found mutilated, though long dismissed as wild animal attacks. Odd disappearances. Unexplained symbols carved into barn doors generations ago. Samuel, Leah, and a small group of trusted volunteers pored over the maps again. This time, not as hikers, not as researchers, but as investigators in a story that refused to end. Old trail logs revealed there had been at least 3 other disappearances connected to the same path in the decades before Elias vanished. None of them were clergy. None of them were widely reported, but they were real, and all had one eerie thing in common. Their last known locations sat within a triangular stretch of land surrounding the mouth of God. And then, something else surfaced. An anonymous letter slipped under the church doors one morning. No name, no fingerprints, just a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. He wasn't the first. He won't be the last. Some paths were never meant to be walked. Law enforcement became involved again, but their presence was nervous, hesitant. The case was officially reopened, but off the record, officers admitted to Samuel that most of them didn't want to step foot near the caves again. Something about the place felt wrong, as though the ground itself rejected the presence of those who asked too many questions. One evening, Leah stood at the edge of the trail where it all began, the same place where Elias was last seen 30 years ago. The wind moved through the trees in slow, hollow waves, and in that silence, she realized something. This wasn't over. The staff wasn't just a remnant. It was a message, a marker, an invitation, or maybe a warning. The trail wasn't finished, because someone or something was still waiting. The deeper they searched, the clearer it became. The forest wasn't just holding secrets from the past. It was still alive with them. Samuel and Leah reviewed old police records again, hunting for patterns. What they uncovered was chilling. Several search logs from 1993 had sections redacted, not for national security, but by request of a third party, whose name was blacked out entirely. Requests made to the local sheriff's office for further details were denied with vague responses. Files missing. No longer available. Clerical error. But it wasn't an error. It was a cover. A deliberate act of erasure. Someone with power had ensured that not only Bishop Elias's fate was hidden, but the very investigation itself was broken before it could begin. Samuel cross-referenced those dates with local government records and found something even more unsettling. The week before Elias disappeared, a private land sale occurred quietly. A section of the mountain trail, including part of the cave system, was purchased by an untraceable holding company. No name, no contact, no explanation. The land had never been used for anything. No buildings, no farming, just silence. As if whoever owned it didn't want to use it. They wanted to control what happened on it. And suddenly, the sealed chamber, the moved staff, the missing files, all made sense. Elias hadn't stumbled upon a mystery of nature. He had walked straight into something designed to remain invisible. Then came the second letter. This time, not delivered to the church, but left inside Samuel's car. No envelope, just a single sheet folded once. The trail ends where the river splits. You won't like what you find. There was no signature, but attached to it was something even worse. A photograph. Recent. Dated just 3 weeks earlier. It showed the entrance to the cave. And standing there was a figure in a long, dark robe. Head turned away. Hands folded behind the back. Watching. The photo wasn't taken by Samuel, or Leah, or anyone they knew, which left one terrifying fact hanging in the air. Whoever sent the photo was watching them. That night, sleep became impossible. Leah sat at her kitchen table, fingers tracing the edges of the photo, her mind racing. Who was the figure? Why reveal themselves now, after so many years? And then a more horrifying question surfaced. Had they ever left? Had someone been walking these trails all these decades, hidden in plain sight? Meanwhile, Samuel cross-referenced the new clue, the mention of where the river splits. Pulling up geological surveys, he found it. A narrow fork in the mountain's hidden water system. Hard to reach, nearly invisible without specific knowledge, and notably absent from any of the public hiking maps. The area had never been searched. Not once. Not in 1993. Not in the years after. With adrenaline overriding fear, they set out before sunrise. The trail was overgrown, nearly erased by time. Branches clawed at their clothes. The sound of the river grew louder with every step, but so did something else. A pulsing quiet. A suffocating stillness that felt less like nature and more like expectation, as though the forest was waiting for them to arrive. When they reached the fork in the river, what they found nearly buckled their knees. Stones, arranged in a perfect circle. At its center, a wooden stake, new, freshly driven into the ground. Hanging from it was a pendant, silver, cracked, covered in soil. It was the bishop's cross, the one Elias had been known to wear every day of his life, the one he never removed. And beneath the pendant, carved into the wood with something sharp, were 3 words. Words that weren't just a message, they were a sentence, a declaration, not finished yet. The message carved into the stake wasn't just haunting, it was a provocation. Not finished yet. Whoever had left it wasn't afraid. In fact, it felt like they were in control, like they had been orchestrating this narrative from the very beginning. Leah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the pendant swaying gently in the breeze. It wasn't just a relic. It was a reminder, a warning, a statement that the forces behind Elias's disappearance were not just history. They were present, active, watching. Samuel scanned the area, looking for footprints, broken branches, anything. But the clearing was too clean, too precise. Whoever had been here knew how to erase their tracks. But one thing stood out. A tree near the river split, its bark freshly scored with deep, deliberate cuts. Not random markings. Symbols. The same as those found in the cave, etched now into living wood, bleeding sap like open wounds. The patterns circled the tree, forming a boundary. A line. A declaration of territory. Samuel snapped photos, his hands shaking despite years of fieldwork. This wasn't like any crime scene he'd studied before. It wasn't evidence left behind in haste. It was a performance. A message designed to be found at exactly the right moment. And suddenly, a terrifying realization struck them both. The staff being discovered, it wasn't an accident. It was the opening act. Returning to town, the tension shifted from curiosity to dread. News spread fast. Locals started locking doors, avoiding the woods entirely. Conversations turned to hushed tones in grocery stores, in churches, at gas stations. Everyone felt it now. The unease wasn't just about the bishop anymore. It was about the realization that something had always been wrong here. And no one had dared admit it until now. That night, Leah sat by her window, staring into the tree line at the edge of town. Her phone buzzed. A message. No number. No contact. Just one image. The same wooden stake. Same pendant. Same words. But this time, the photo was different. It was taken from a different angle. From behind the stake. Facing the trail. As if whoever sent it wasn't just documenting the message, but watching whoever came to read it. The morning after the photo arrived, Leah knew one thing for certain. They weren't just chasing answers anymore. They were being led, guided, toyed with. Someone was crafting this narrative with precision, leaving pieces, pushing them closer, step by step. But closer to what? Samuel doubled down, mapping every clue, every location. Patterns began to emerge. The bishop's original pilgrimage route, the caves, the river split, they all connected to a triangulated space deeper in the mountains. An area with no records, no trails, no documented visits in over 50 years. Locals called it the Hollow. Not a valley, not a forest. Something different. A place that didn't exist on any official map, but lived in the oldest whispers of the town. Digging through town archives, Leah found one final piece of the puzzle. A journal. Handwritten. Dated 1961. The author was Father Alan Mercer, a priest who had briefly served in the region before transferring, abruptly. His final entry was only 4 lines long. The Hollow watches. The Hollow decides. He saw it. He should not have. Neither should I. The entry ended there. No explanation. No follow-up. Father Mercer had resigned days later and left the priesthood entirely. By now, fear had evolved into obsession. Leah and Samuel stood at crossroads. They could hand everything to law enforcement, to the diocese, to someone, anyone, and step away. But deep down, they both knew the truth. No one else would finish this. No one else could. Every person who had gotten too close had either vanished, walked away, or been silenced. As they prepared to enter the Hollow, Leah paused at the edge of her property, staring into the mountains. The same mountains where Bishop Elias had walked 30 years ago. She whispered quietly into the wind, not sure if it was prayer or defiance. If you're still watching, so are we. And then, without looking back, they stepped into the forest, into the final chapter of a story that was never supposed to be told. The moment Leah and Samuel crossed into the hollow, the world shifted. The dense forest felt heavier here, oppressive, like walking underwater. The trees stood unnaturally close together, their trunks gnarled, branches tangled like twisted hands. No birds, no wind, just silence so thick it seemed to press against their eardrums, forcing their own breathing to sound foreign, too loud, intrusive. The trail, if it could even be called that, was little more than a faint depression in the ground. And yet, it was clear that someone had walked it before them. Recently, fresh boot prints marred the soft mud. But not just one pair. Multiple. Some large, some smaller, pacing back and forth, circling, watching, waiting. Leah's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a place. They had entered someone's domain. As they moved deeper, strange objects began to appear. Bones, animal, likely, but arranged deliberately in geometric patterns along the path. Small effigies hung from tree branches, crudely fashioned from sticks, cloth, and twine. Some were humanoid in shape. Others weren't. Each one had something carved into its surface, the same symbols from the cave, the tree, the pendant stake. Repeating, looping, a language of warning or perhaps a boundary marker. And then the sound, a rhythmic tapping, soft, steady, echoed from somewhere ahead. Not natural, not random. Leah froze, her eyes scanning the shadows. Samuel held up his hand, signaling her to stay low. The tapping stopped. Silence again. Then footsteps. Not close. Not running. Just pacing. Someone, or something, was moving just beyond their line of sight, keeping parallel with them. Following. Hurting. At the heart of the hollow, they stumbled into a clearing. Perfectly circular. At its center, an altar, stone, ancient, covered in moss and dirt. And atop another staff. Not the bishop's. Different. Older. Bound with strips of leather. Symbols carved so deep it looked as though the wood itself had bled. And beneath it, freshly placed a journal. Bound in black. Waiting. As if someone had left it there, for them. Samuel approached the altar first, scanning the perimeter while Leah hesitated, her eyes locked on the journal. Something about it felt wrong. Like touching it would mean crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the choice was already made. Whoever left it wanted them to find it. It wasn't bait. It was an invitation. The journal was old. The leather cracked, the edges frayed, but the inside pristine. Every page filled with cramped handwriting. Dates, observations, symbols meticulously drawn, maps sketched in the margins. The first entry was dated April 2nd, 1993. The day before Bishop Elias disappeared. The signature at the bottom sent a shock through Leah's spine. E.C. Elias Carmichael. His handwriting. His words. But as Leah flipped through the pages, a horrifying truth emerged. These weren't just the bishop's thoughts during the pilgrimage. They were notes from after. After he vanished. Dated for weeks beyond the day the world assumed he was gone. The entries were frantic. Scattered. Paranoid. It watches. I cannot leave. Every attempt leads me back. The path shifts. The trees, they move. And then, later, they're not men. Or maybe they were once. They were faces. Faces that don't fit. Samuel paced the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement, but the forest stood eerily still, as though listening. Leah's hands trembled as she reached the final page. The words were jagged, the ink smeared as though written in panic. If someone finds this, it means they let you. But you won't leave. You think you will. But you won't. No signature. No goodbye. Just those final words pressed into the paper like a scar. Then, behind them, movement. Not fast. Not aggressive. Slow. Deliberate. Branches cracking. Leaves crunching under heavy steps. Samuel spun, flashlight cutting through the dark. A shape. Tall. Too tall. Its frame barely distinguishable from the trees around it, as though it had grown out of the woods themselves. And then, it stepped forward. Not running. Not attacking. Just watching. And in that moment, both Leah and Samuel understood something terrible. The trail hadn't brought them here. It had brought them home. For a moment, time itself seemed to fracture. Leah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so violently it drowned out every other sound. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half flesh, half shadow, its limbs unnaturally elongated, torso hunched as though stitched together by something that didn't fully understand the human form. And its face, God's face, blank, pale, too smooth, as if something was wearing a mask made of skin, stretched and hollow. Samuel gripped Leah's arm, pulling her back behind him, but the figure didn't move closer. Instead, it tilted its head, slowly, unnervingly, as if examining them, as if deciding. A low, guttural sound vibrated from its chest. Not speech, not animal, but something primal, something ancient. The forest responded. The wind shifted. Branches trembled. It was as though the very air grew heavier under the weight of whatever this thing was. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped backward, slowly, into the trees. Its body blended perfectly into the gnarled shapes of the forest. One step, two, and then it was gone. Not vanished, just unseen. Watching, always watching. Leah stood frozen, unable to process whether they had just survived an encounter or been marked. Samuel turned toward the journal again, snapping photos of each page in frantic succession. "We need to leave. Now." His voice was low, urgent, barely above a whisper, like raising it would summon something worse. Leah nodded, but her eyes were still locked on the place where the figure had stood. Something about it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like permission, as if whatever rules governed the hollow had allowed them to see, just enough to understand they were prey. As they backed out of the clearing, the oppressive silence followed. Every crack of a twig underfoot felt like a scream. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps just out of view. And though neither of them dared speak it aloud, they both felt the same horrific truth settle into their bones. The bishop hadn't gotten lost. He hadn't simply stumbled into something terrible. He had been chosen. The trek back to the edge of the hollow felt endless. The path seemed longer than it had been coming in, twisted, unfamiliar, as if the forest itself shifted behind them, reshaping. Several times, Samuel checked the GPS on his phone, only to see the screen glitch, the map spinning wildly as though no signal could hold steady in this place. They were being followed, not by footsteps, but by presence, an oppressive, suffocating weight that never let them breathe fully. When they finally crossed the tree line back into the known trail, it was like stepping out from under deep water. The air felt lighter. Sound returned. The distant rustle of birds. The whisper of wind. But the relief was laced with something sharper. Certainty. They hadn't escaped. They'd been let go. For now. Back in town, their appearance startled everyone. Dirt-smeared. Pale. Eyes wide and hollow like people who had seen something that could never be unseen. They immediately downloaded the photos from the journal. Page after page of evidence. Dates that proved Elias survived for weeks beyond his supposed disappearance. Notes describing the same symbols they'd seen in the caves, the river split, and something more. Buried deep in the middle of the journal was a page, torn halfway out. Only fragments remained, but one sentence was clear. It wears faith like a mask. It knows the prayers. It whispers them back wrong. A creature. A force. Something that had long hidden beneath the rituals and symbols of the mountain's history, feeding not just on fear, but on devotion twisted into something unrecognizable. As Samuel pieced together the map drawn in the journal's margins, another horrifying realization surfaced. The locations marked weren't random. They formed a perfect geometric pattern stretching across the mountain's oldest settlements, abandoned chapels, graveyards, and the very place where Elias had vanished. A symbol, not one of protection, but one of containment, or worse, of summoning. Leah stared at it, dread sinking deep into her chest. This wasn't about him, she whispered. It was never just about him. It's about what's still here. The full weight of the journal's revelation settled on them like a vice. This was no coincidence. No tragic accident of a man wandering too far. The pattern, the symbols, the placement of everything, the caves, the river split, the altar in the hollow. This wasn't just a map. It was a boundary, a prison, or perhaps the doorway. And the bishop? He hadn't just crossed the line. He had triggered something. Something ancient. Something waiting. Leah's hands trembled as she pointed to a section circled in the bishop's map, a site they hadn't visited yet, deeper north, marked only with 2 words in jagged, desperate handwriting. It began here. What was it? Was this the origin of what consumed Bishop Elias? Or was it the center of the pattern, the heartbeat of something buried so deep in the mountain that even time itself had forgotten how to speak of it? Samuel's face was pale as he scrolled through the photos again. The symbols weren't random, he realized. Cross-referencing with ancient texts, he began decoding fragments. Some matched known sigils from medieval religious rituals, protection, banishment, but others didn't. Symbols predating organized religion, shapes that belonged to something older than language, glyphs carved not to ward off evil, but to trap it, or worse, to feed it. Then Leah's phone buzzed. Another message. No number, no sender, just a photo, grainy, blurry, but unmistakable. The clearing from the hollow, the altar, but this time there was something on it. A figure, kneeling, hooded, unmoving, and behind it, standing in the tree line, was the same towering shadow they had seen before. Watching, closer now, closer than it had ever dared come. Alongside the image was a single sentence. Typed, cold, final. Come see how this ends. It was no longer a question of whether they could walk away. The choice had already been made for them. The trail wasn't finished, and the thing that had waited 30 years wasn't waiting anymore. As dawn broke, Leah and Samuel stood at the edge of the final marked point on the bishop's map. The air was thinner here, not higher in altitude, but like the air itself resisted being breathed. The forest was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of the river. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, not emptiness, absence, as if everything living knew not to step here. The entrance was hidden, a narrow fissure between 2 jagged rocks. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past. But Elias had found it. His notes described the place with dread, a mouth not made for words, a throat carved for swallowing. Leah's skin crawled reading it again. What had the bishop seen when he stood here 30 years ago? What had he realized too late? As they slipped inside, flashlights barely pierced the suffocating dark. The tunnel sloped downward, walls damp with something that wasn't just moisture. It smelled of iron, of earth, of something old, something rotted. Symbols covered every surface, scrawled in charcoal, carved into stone, smeared in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Some were familiar, some twisted into shapes that hurt to look at too long. Deeper in, the air changed again, vibrated. A low hum, like thousands of voices whispering at the edge of hearing, just out of comprehension. It wasn't sound. It was presence. Pressure. A thrum that seemed to pulse in side bone rather than ear. And then, the tunnel opened into a cavern. Wide. Circular. Perfectly shaped. Not by nature, but by hands. Or something that used to have hands. At the center stood a stone pedestal. And on it, a second journal. Smaller. Newer. Bound in black. Samuel picked it up, fingers trembling, and opened the first page. One line, written in neat, deliberate letters. It never wanted him. It was always meant for who came next. And from the shadows, the sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, close. The sound of breathing grew heavier, deeper, vibrating through the cavern walls like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything human. Leah's flashlight flickered, then steadied, casting trembling beams across the jagged stones. The air thickened, dense, suffocating, as if the cavern itself was inhaling. Waiting, watching. Samuel stood frozen, gripping the black journal like a lifeline, his eyes darting into the darkness where the breathing pulsed, closer. And then, it stepped forward. A figure, tall, obscenely tall, wrapped in folds of dark fabric that seemed less like clothing and more like shadow woven into shape. Its hands, if they could be called that, were too long, fingers jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Its face remained obscured beneath a cowl, except for one detail. A smile. Stretched. Carved. Not a flesh. Not a bone. Something else. Something that wore the suggestion of a face like a predator mimicking prey. Neither Leah nor Samuel could speak. Their throats locked. The figure didn't lunge. Didn't attack. It simply tilted its head, watching, studying. Then, Slowly it raised one hand and pointed. Not at them. At the journal Samuel held. The message was clear. This was a transaction. A ritual. A passage. Not an ambush. Not yet. Samuel forced his eyes down to the journal and turned the page. Another line, handwritten, waited there like a blade. The one who opens this finishes it. His hands trembled as he flipped the next page. Lines, drawings, maps. Not of the caves, not of the mountain, but of symbols layered over symbols, tracing generations of boundaries. The same pattern the bishop had drawn, but this one was complete. One corner had been missing from the bishop's map. This one showed the last piece. It wasn't the hollow. It wasn't the caves. It was the town, the entire town of Emeryville. Streets, churches, homes. The pattern wasn't a boundary. It was a net. In the center of it was the cathedral itself, where Bishop Elias had begun his pilgrimage 30 years ago, where it had always begun. The realization shattered something inside Leah. It had never been about the trail, not the caves, not the river. The pilgrimage wasn't a path away from something. It was a loop, a circuit, a ritual that had been completed over and over again across generations. The bishop hadn't stumbled into something. He had been sent into it, fed to it. Samuel flipped faster now, scanning page after page. More diagrams, more writing. It needs the walker, the one who carries the burden, the one who believes they are the seeker. It needs their faith, their fear, their surrender. And then the final entry, written in different handwriting, sharper, less human, almost childlike in its uneven strokes. You came because we called. You stayed because you chose. You leave because we let you. But not without leaving something behind. A movement in the darkness. The breathing grew faster. Excited. Anticipating. The figure's head tilted back, and for the first time, it made a sound, not speech, not words. A low, clicking rasp. Almost laughter. But laughter made wrong. Twisted. Mocking. Samuel grabbed Leah's hand. We run, he hissed. Now. They spun, sprinting toward the narrow passage they'd entered through. The shadows behind them lunged, not with bodies, but with weight. The air itself grew heavier, pressing against their lungs, dragging at their limbs like hands made of gravity. The tunnel narrowed. Their footsteps pounded against stone. Behind them, the breathing grew louder, layered now with voices. Not screams, not words. Prayers. Chanted. Backwards. Wrong. Words meant for salvation, turned inside out. Light. The crack of daylight appeared ahead. The opening. Freedom. They didn't dare look back as they burst out of the fissure, collapsing onto the dirt, gasping for air. The forest felt alive again. Birds. Wind. Sunlight. But neither of them felt relief. Because as they lay there, trembling, Leah turned the black journal to its final page. A symbol had been drawn there overnight, in ink that hadn't been on it when they first opened it. A symbol neither of them had ever seen before. Underneath, 5 words were written. 5 words that froze her blood colder than anything she had seen in that cavern. This is how it starts. The words burned into Leah's mind. This is how it starts. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't closure. It was a beginning. A beginning of what? Neither she nor Samuel dared fully imagine. But the message was unmistakable. The thing they'd uncovered hadn't been waiting for them to finish something. It had been waiting for them to begin it. Back in town, the world felt wrong. Subtly warped. The streets looked the same. The buildings stood exactly where they always had. But the air carried something different now. Heavier. Like the mountain had exhaled something that hadn't touched the town in decades. Or maybe something that had always been there, but hidden beneath the rhythms of daily life. And now it no longer needed to hide. Samuel immediately pinned the symbol from the final page of the journal to the wall in his office, comparing it to the ones they'd seen in the caves, on the stones, on the trees. But this one was different. It wasn't a boundary marker. It wasn't a summoning glyph. It was a seal, a completion symbol. Something had been locked, or worse, unlocked. Meanwhile, Leah combed through the bishop's journal again, searching for anything they'd missed. And there it was, buried between 2 pages, nearly invisible unless the light hit just right. A note scribbled in the margin, almost an afterthought. They won't take me back. They only take forward. The meaning hit like a hammer. The bishop hadn't been captured. He hadn't been hunted. He had been delivered. A sacrifice not to the past, but to something waiting in the future. As evening fell, the cathedral bells rang, but no one had rung them. The sound echoed through the town like a ripple, thick, distorted, off-key. Windows rattled, dogs howled, and everyone stopped what they were doing. Because whether they knew the full story or not, everyone felt the shift. The sense that something sacred had just cracked wide open, and something inside had begun to stir. The next morning, the town awoke to find something impossible. All around the cathedral, symbols had appeared overnight, carved into the wood of doors, into the stone of walls, even into the pavement itself. The same symbol from the journal, perfectly drawn, as though placed by hands that didn't need tools, didn't need rest, didn't need permission. No one admitted to hearing anything. No footsteps, no vandalism. It was as if the symbols had simply emerged, grown, like roots from beneath the town, breaking through the surface, reminding everyone that the ground they walked on wasn't as solid as they believed. Leah and Samuel stood at the cathedral steps, staring. For the first time since the bishop vanished, the doors were wide open. But inside, darkness. No service, no congregation, just a void. The air that flowed from within felt colder than the mountain caves. Heavier, almost electric, as though the very concept of space inside the church had been rewritten. And then came the message. Another envelope. No name, no address. Slipped beneath Leah's door. Inside was a photo, a black and white image of the cathedral, but not as it looked now, as it had looked before it was built. A clearing, a field, and in the center of that field, an altar. Stone, familiar, the same altar they had found deep within the hollow. The implication was devastating. The cathedral had been built on top of something, not over it, not to bury it, but to seal it, to feed it, to serve it. And the pilgrimage, the bishop's walk into the mountains, was never meant to be a journey of faith. It was part of the design, part of the ritual. At the bottom of the photo, scrawled in trembling ink, 5 words sent ice flooding through Leah's veins. It starts. You brought it. The weight of those words, it starts. You brought it, hit Leah and Samuel like a collapse of everything they once understood. This hadn't been a discovery. It had been a delivery. Every step they took, every page they turned, every line they followed from the bishop's journal, it had all been part of something older than either of them could comprehend. Not an accident, not a mistake, a design. Panic rippled beneath the skin of the town. People noticed the symbols. Some covered them with boards. Others scrubbed frantically at stone with wire brushes, as if physical effort could erase what had been etched into the very bones of the place. But the symbols didn't fade. They deepened. Cracks formed along the edges of streets. The earth seemed to breathe, slow, heavy pulses beneath their feet. Something was moving. Below. Leah traced the lines on the photograph again and again. The clearing, the altar, the cathedral, the perfect overlay. Her stomach twisted as the realization locked into place. The pilgrimage had never been about the mountain. It was about the circle, the closing of it. The bishop had been a key, a vessel, and so were they. So was anyone foolish enough to ask the right questions in the wrong place? Samuel paced, hands shaking, rereading the last journal entries. They won't take me back. They only take forward. He understood now. It wasn't about killing. It wasn't about blood. It was about continuation, propagation. Each walker, each seeker, each pilgrim didn't close the story, they extended it, pushed it further into the world. The ritual wasn't complete until someone else carried it forward. As night fell, the bells rang again, louder, closer, but this time, not from the cathedral, from a forest, from a mountain, from the hollow. The sound didn't echo like metal. It pulsed like breath, like something vast, something awake, calling not from above, but from beneath. The ground trembled at dawn, subtle like something shifting miles below, but real. Cracks spiderwebbed along the cathedral floor, perfectly aligning with the symbols burned into the stone. And beneath those cracks movement, a vibration, a pulse, not mechanical, not geological, alive. Leah and Samuel gathered what they could. The journals, the photographs, the maps. Their instinct screamed to run, to leave, to get as far from Emeryville as possible. But something deeper, something colder, whispered that it wouldn't matter. This was no longer confined to a trail, a cave, a church. It never had been. At the town's edge, thick mist began rolling down from the mountain. Too dense, too heavy, swallowing streets, homes, streetlights. Inside the fog, shapes moved, not fully seen, just the suggestion of limbs too long, faces too stretched, smiles that didn't bend where mouths should bend. People locked their doors, pulled curtains tight, but somehow they knew it was futile, locking the door when the house itself had already been swallowed. Then came the third envelope, pinned to the cathedral doors. Inside, one final photograph. The altar, but not empty. A figure stood behind it, robes stitched from something that shimmered wet under the flash. A mask, no face, but hands visible, too many fingers. And one line, written beneath the image, in a language neither of them recognized, but both understood completely. The walker has returned. Samuel dropped the photo. Leah stared ahead, trembling, whispering more to herself than anyone else. It was never about the bishop. It was never about the pilgrimage. It was always about the return. Behind them, the bells rang again, this time not a chime, but a shriek. A scream dragged through iron, echoing across the sky like the mountain itself had begun to speak. And as the fog swallowed the last of the morning light, the trail reopened. As the fog thickened, consuming the streets like a living tide, the trail appeared, cutting straight through the center of town where no trail had ever existed. It wasn't dirt or gravel. It was something darker, older, a scar running through the earth itself. And from its edges, the symbols began to pulse. Not glow, not shimmer, but breathe, contracting, expanding, as though the town itself had lungs, as though something inside had been holding its breath for far too long, and was now ready to exhale. Leah and Samuel stood at the edge of it, hearts pounding, every instinct screaming to run. But where? The road wasn't just open, it was calling. A pressure in their chests, like gravity turned sideways, pulled at their bones. A voice, not loud, not audible, but undeniable, murmured at the edge of their thoughts. Walk. You've always known this was where it led. And they realized, with a sinking horror, that the trail didn't lead into the mountains anymore. It led straight to the cathedral. They turned, slowly, to see the church doors wide open. Darkness spilled from inside, thick like smoke, pooling across the steps. The stained glass windows flickered, shapes moving behind them, figures, silhouettes, pacing as if impatient. And then, that sound again, the breathing. Louder now, everywhere, coming from the walls, from the ground, from the air itself. A crowd had gathered without realizing it. Neighbors, strangers, drawn from their homes by instinct, by confusion, or by something deeper. But no one spoke. No one ran. Every person stood slack-jawed, wide-eyed, watching as if their minds fought against seeing what their eyes could no longer deny. Some began to tremble. Others dropped to their knees, not in prayer, in surrender. And then, from the open cathedral doors, it stepped out, taller than any human, limbs too long, a robe stitched from shadow, and something wet that reflected the dawn like oil. Its face was a void, a smile carved where no mouth belonged. But worse were the hands. Familiar, not monstrous, not claws. Human hands. Pale, dozens of them, emerging from beneath the robes. Fingers twitching, reaching, searching. The moment the figure touched the threshold of the cathedral, the bells stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound, so dense it felt like it could break bone. And then it raised one hand, if it could be called that, toward the trail. Not to block it, not to close it, to welcome. Leah gripped Samuel's arm, breath shallow, whispering, "It isn't here for us. We're not the only ones." She turned and saw it. The realization hit her like ice in her veins. The trail wasn't just a line etched in the ground. It was a summons, a mirror. And from every direction, out of the fog, out of the alleys, out of homes, people were walking. Not panicking, not resisting. Walking. Faces blank. Feet steady. Eyes glassy, empty. It had always been this way. The bishop wasn't the first. He wasn't the mistake. He was the blueprint. The walker. The one who goes forward, never back. And now the pattern had replicated. Perfectly. Systematically. Completely. Samuel flipped open the black journal, desperate for anything. A map, a line, a warning. And there, tucked into the back cover, a page neither of them had seen before. New ink, wet, fresh, written in handwriting that matched neither the bishop's nor Samuel's own. Just 6 words. The first step is the hardest. Then the ground shook, not from beneath, but from within. The cathedral split open at its foundation, stone crumbling outward, as if something massive, something ancient, was forcing its way up. Not down, not from below, from inside, from where it had always been. The crowd didn't scream, didn't fight. They walked, one by one, toward the threshold, toward the thing, toward the trail. And as the first foot crossed the line, Leah realized the most horrifying truth of all. This was never about finding the bishop. It was never about solving the mystery. It was always about the trail reopening. And now, it would never close again. The trail pulsed beneath their feet like a living artery. Every step taken by the mindless crowd made the symbols glow darker, deeper, like wounds reopening, bleeding into the soil. The fog seemed to vibrate, swirling faster as if it were a veil, thinning, cracking. And through those cracks, shapes moved, shadows with form, bodies without faces, smiles without mouths, watching, waiting, welcoming. Leah's legs felt cemented to the ground. Her instinct screamed to her to run, but her body refused. Beside her, Samuel clutched the black journal, his knuckles white, his face drained of all color. "We triggered it," he muttered, voice hollow. "We followed the steps. We finished the circuit." His eyes darted wildly to the cathedral, to the trail, to the thing standing at the threshold, its hands extended, fingers splayed, twitching like antennae feeling the air. Searching, counting. But then, something changed. The figure didn't step forward. It turned its head, slowly, toward Leah and Samuel. For the first time, it acknowledged them directly. And in that moment, the air thinned to nothing. Silence roared like a vacuum. The crowd halted mid-step, frozen. The breathing stopped. The fog paused. The trail went still. Time itself seemed to collapse into a single point, waiting for what came next. The figure raised its hand again, but this time, it wasn't beckoning. It pointed, straight at them. No words, no sound, just that one, singular gesture. The meaning was undeniable. "You open the gate. You finish the walk." Leah's knees buckled. Samuel backed away, shaking his head. No, we're not part of this. We weren't supposed to." His voice caught, strangled by terror. But deep down, they both knew the truth. The moment they opened the bishop's journal, the moment they stepped onto that forgotten trail, the moment they saw the hollow, they weren't observers. They were the offering. The trail twisted before them, stretching farther than any road ever had. It no longer bent through the forest. It no longer curved toward the mountain. Now, impossibly, it stretched into the horizon, a horizon that didn't exist. One made of black sky split with red cracks, of ground stitched together from pieces that didn't fit. A place outside a place. A world beneath the world. And the crowd began walking again. Not toward the cathedral, not toward the figure, toward the trail. Their bodies rigid, controlled, puppets pulled forward by strings of will that weren't theirs. Some wept silently, eyes blank, but cheeks wet with tears they couldn't explain. Others smiled, wide, unnatural, as though something inside them rejoiced while something else died. Samuel grabbed Leah's arm, his voice barely a whisper. "If we step on that trail, we don't come back." His eyes scanned hers, desperate for some answer, some solution, but Leah had none. Her voice trembled as she answered, "But if we don't, none of them come back either." Behind them, the cathedral groaned. Cracks split its facade. The earth trembled beneath its foundation. And from those cracks, hands. Dozens. Hundreds. White. Boneless. Crawling upward, dragging shapes behind them. Forms that glistened wet and raw. Unfinished, as if reality itself was still deciding what they were supposed to become. The figure at the threshold lowered its hand, folding it back beneath the endless tangle of arms. And then it stepped aside, making room, leaving the path open. For them. For the walkers. For the next chapter. And as Leah and Samuel stared into the abyss where the trail now led, one final sound cut through the tremor of the world collapsing around them. The bells. Ringing. Over and over and over. Not from a cathedral. Not from the mountain, from the trail itself, calling. With every toll of the bells, the ground beneath the trail seemed to breathe, rising, falling, like the earth itself had become a lung for something vast and waking. The fog peeled back in layers, revealing that the path no longer followed any logic of distance, terrain, or reality. It weaved through places that should not exist, arches of bone rising from the dirt, trees growing upside down, roots tangled with fragments of stone altars and crumbling pews. A twisted mockery of the sacred. The crowd continued forward, as though tethered by invisible threads. Some stumbled, faces slack and hollow. Others whispered prayers, whether to God or to the thing waiting at the end of the trail, no one could tell. And, at the center of it all, that figure. The watcher. The gatekeeper. The thing that wasn't man and wasn't beast. It followed without walking. Its shadow stretched across the trail like a bridge to something unspeakable. Leah clutched Samuel's hand, her fingers digging into his skin as the realization fully crystallized. We're not just witnesses. We were the invitation. Her voice trembled as the words left her lips. Samuel didn't argue. He simply nodded, jaw clenched, holding back the scream building in his chest. Because the deeper truth was unavoidable now. Every step they had taken since finding the staff had been preordained. Not by faith, not by fate, by design. The trail ended ahead, but not in any destination. It simply broke open, into a chasm, a void, an abyss that pulsed with color not meant for human eyes. Blacks deeper than black, reds that bled light, fractures in the sky that showed glimpses of something. Things with no names, movements with no forms, shapes that existed only as the suggestion of nightmare. At the very edge of the chasm, a final altar stood, crude, stone split by time, and on it, the bishop's walking staff, upright, perfect, untouched, as if it had never been lost, as if it had never left this place, as if it had been waiting for the next walker. The bell stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, so thick it pressed against skin, wrapped around bone. The crowd halted in perfect unison. No instructions, no hesitation. Each person turned, slowly, deliberately, to face Leah and Samuel. The figure, the gatekeeper, drifted forward, its countless hands folding beneath its shroud, its mouthless face stretching into that impossible grin. And from the folds of shadow, it extended one hand, palm open, waiting, offering or demanding. Samuel stared at the staff. His breath caught. His knees buckled. "It's a choice," he whispered. Or maybe it never was. Leah squeezed his hand, her voice barely audible. "If we take it, it continues. If we don't, it still does. But maybe the next trail isn't ours." In the suffocating quiet, the earth trembled once more. Cracks spread through the stones, light pouring from beneath, light that didn't illuminate but consumed. And from within that light, voices. Chanting, whispering, names. Familiar, unfamiliar. Names of those long gone, names of those still walking. Leah stepped forward, toward the altar, toward the staff. Her vision blurred. Her ears rang. But one line from the bishop's journal echoed louder than everything else. "It never wanted me back. It only ever wants forward." Her fingers brushed the wood, smooth, warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. And in that moment, the trail behind her fractured, split into dozens of paths. Endless, infinite, stretching into places no map would ever chart. Because the trail never ends. It only waits for the next walker. And as the fog swallowed them whole, the bells began to ring once more. Forever. Some stories were never meant to have clear endings. Some mysteries aren't puzzles designed to be solved, but mirrors, forcing us to confront not what we don't know, but what we were never meant to understand. The disappearance of Bishop Elias Carmichael was never about a man who got lost. It was about the weight of a path walked too many times. A trail that doesn't lead forward or back, but inward, deeper, into places not written on any map, but etched into something older than memory. It makes you wonder, how many doors have we passed in our own lives without knowing they were doors? How many trails did we almost take? How many questions did we silence before the answers found us first? The most terrifying truths are never the ones we search for. They're the ones waiting for someone foolish, curious, or brave enough to ask. And once asked, there's no one asking them. The bishop's staff was never just a symbol of faith. It was a marker, a key, a declaration that someone had walked and someone else would follow. The line between seeker and sacrifice was never as clear as we wanted to believe. And perhaps that's the lesson buried beneath it all, that some trails don't exist until you step onto them. And once you do, you carry something forward that can never be put down. So, now that you've walked this path with me, look around. Listen closely. Sometimes, the trail isn't miles away in forgotten woods or beneath abandoned chapels. Sometimes, it starts with a question, a whisper, a story you can't forget. And once you hear it, once it lives inside you, the trail never truly disappears again. If this story made you feel something, if it shook you, made you think, or opened a door you weren't expecting, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because the trail continues. And now, maybe part of it lives with you.